So, many years ago, when I turned 16, I moved halfway down the UK, all the way to a town called Redditch near Birmingham. I had met a girl online, and being a stupid kid, I decided I was in love, and we got a small bedsit together. But that is a story for another time. I signed on with an agency and got a temp position with Royal Mail, and it was awesome. I enjoyed every part of the job, but being a temp, we always got paired up with other temps to ensure we would get the job done. I liked meeting new people and had a blast with most, but there was this one guy. Sometimes we would get given our own home to deliver to. Being temps, we obviously had a brew and a breakfast halfway through the shift if this was the case. So me and Mackerel Eyes get put en route together, and he just seemed off. He smelled bad, like he didn't wash, and had these dead mackerel eyes. And if you said something he didn't understand, he wouldn't ask you to repeat or anything. He would just look at your mouth agape, mackerel eyes staring, until you said something he did understand. We sorted our letters and parcels out, ready to leave, but before we did, he mentioned that this is near his flat, so we could grab a brew and have a quick break. Being young and stupid, I just said okay, not really considering the fact that I'd be going into his home, alone, for a period of time. I was just thinking, a nice feet up and a brew. Dinner time came, and as we got to his flat, it dawned on me, but it was already too late. I was at the door, so I just thought, what's the worst he could do? What an idiotic boob I was. Now I realise all the worst scenarios, but hindsight is 2020. I entered what can only be described as a porn palace. And I use the term palace loosely, very loosely. There were VHS tapes on all the shelves of every kind of porn you could dream of. I didn't see anything I would consider illegal. It was all store-bought porn, but it was still pretty weird. He may as well have not had a carpet, because that too was porn. Magazines everywhere. He goes and make a brew, and I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I should have said no to this. He walked back into the living room from his kitchen, and he looked wild. I mean dead mackerel eyes staring, mouth open, and holding in his hand a samurai sword. He unsheathed his weapon, the sword I mean, and said, Look, it's genuine, feel how sharp it is." So I ran my finger over the blade, and yep, sharp. And then he just stands there with it, looking over at me while I'm sat, asshole puckered like never before, wondering about the many ways which he planned to kill me. It might have been a minute he just stood there, but it felt like forever. He then starts slashing the air like a child who thinks he has cool moves, making the swishing air noises with his mouth, crouching down, hopping into his sofa, and I've just sat there. Now I have the dead mackerel eyes with a gaping mouth. Pretty awesome, yeah? Yeah, amazing. After a minute or two of him slashing around, he sheathes his sword and returns to finish the cup of tea. And I swear, when I looked into the cup, there was more wildlife in it than the local pond. We sat there for about 20 minutes in silence, drinking our tea. Broth might be more accurate. And then I just got up and said, "Off we go then." And that was that. Really boring ending, but I'm thankful it was. Looking back, he was just a lonely middle-aged man with mental health issues, and that breaks my heart. I never saw him again. We got outside and I suggested we split up. I assume we finished at different times because he was never seen by me again. Regardless, Temp Postman, let's never meet again. This happened during my senior year of high school back in 2007. I was living at my parents' house, who weren't extremely well off, so we didn't have central heat and air. This happened not long before my graduation, so April or May, which meant some nights was hot outside, so we regularly opened the windows to put a box fan in the window. My room was a corner room, so I had two windows, one facing the front of the house towards the street, and one facing the side of the house. My bed ran parallel to the side window, with maybe a foot of space between that wall and my bed. The window came to about the middle of the bed. Directly under the window was my outlet. It hadn't been a very warm week, so my box fan wasn't in my window. One night, I was sitting in my bed, working on some report for school. About 30 to 45 minutes into it, I see my laptop battery is low, so I decide to plug it in. I grab the charger out of my bag and lean over to the outlet under the window. As I'm plugging it in, I glance up at the window and see a man staring down at me. I had a brief heart attack and scrambled away from the window, never taking my eyes off him. He's just standing there, leaning over and looking straight at me. He looked angry, like I had viciously attacked him on a very personal level. This might be a good time to mention that I didn't even have a screen in my window. I can't speak, I can't move, I can't scream for help. I don't even know if anyone is home. We stay like that for what feels like forever, but may have only been a few seconds. Just frozen, staring at each other. I wanted to get off from my bed and head for the door, but I'm afraid to turn my back to him. Finally, he starts shaking his head and says, "Anyone could crawl through." I don't know why, but the way he said "crawl through" sent shivers down my spine. Maybe it was the fact that that was what he chose to say. I imagined him crawling through my window every night without me knowing, and it just filled me with even more horror. I threw myself off the bed and ran for my door and screamed for my brother and my dad while running down the hallway. They came out and I frantically told them what happened, and they ran outside to check around the house, but didn't find anything. We moved out not long after graduation, but I will never forget the way he said those words. Anyone could crawl through. This was quite easily the closest I've ever come to cardiac arrest, and considering some of the professions I've had, that's saying a bit. In mid-2004, I'd become newly separated from my wife, and decided a getaway and career change were in order. Call it a geographical cure if you will, but that's a story for another time. I decided to move a couple thousand miles from my home to attend a quick 4-month continuing education course in industrial radiography and ultrasonics in Calgary, Alberta. I'd fared well in the course, and due to the oil boom happening in North America at the time, I was literally hired by a large company waiting outside the doors as we graduated from our educational endeavours. Taking the job entailed moving a further 800 miles into the north of Canada, to be based out of a small town which serviced the surrounding oil fields. I had no idea what the place would be like and what I'd be in store for. At the time, the north of the Canadian prairies had taken all of the influx of workers that it could, and infrastructure didn't really grow with the boom. Trying to find a place to live up there was next to impossible. I'm not at all stretching the truth when I say that people were renting their balconies for people to pitch their tents on in a couple of places. I kid you not. Some of the places that ended up being rented out weren't really fit for human habitation. This was the Black Gold Rush. I overstayed my welcome chit in the hotel they put me up in for a month and was told that I had to find a place to live. It was absolutely next to impossible to find accommodation for a few reasons. I was working between 12 to 20 hours a day, and the vacancy rate was less than 0%. I decided to look at some outlying communities. I asked for a day off and ended up driving about an hour from our office and found a small farming community. I use the word community loosely. This was a spattering of easily 60 to 100-year-old dilapidated houses centered around a greasy main street. Liquor store doubled as a post office, bar doubled as a hotel, and the grocery store looked and smelled of a slaughterhouse that could have been condemned. Wild West look. I drove by an old house that had been obviously divided into several apartments and almost couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the orange and black for rent sign screaming out at me. My heart did sink a bit. The place was clapboard, and the kind of dirty you can see before you even get out of your truck. At this point, after about a month of brutality on the pipelines of Alberta, I was exhausted and simply didn't care. It was irony abound. I was making wicked money and could have afforded an uptown place, but because of the boom, I was going to be forced to live in a damn ditch. Great. Again, I digress. I ended up taking an apartment in this building. That's an abuse of the word apartment. This was a dive beyond dives. They say that Alberta is rat-free, but I can attest that the statement is a crock of crap. And I don't mean just of the variety rodentia. The people living in this building could have easily qualified as something that had crawled from the oil and grease-laden hulls of a ship, straight up the steps and into a pile of meth on a cheap kitchen table. The place itself was enough that I could easily have said, let's not meet. Carpets that were once grey were now an indescribable clay colour. Dirt rubbed into dirt, into an off-sale, off-tint paint carelessly rubbed all over the place with a $1 brush. And the smell. Think of unwashed hair wrapped around rotted vegetables that could have been thrown into a wet paper bag, and you are getting somewhere close. After sighing loudly and handing $2,000 over to the landlord in cash, I took the place. Didn't have a choice. Besides being exhausted, I knew I'd not get another day off. And I was right. I worked from July to December 24th without a day off, barring the day I procured my glorious abode. I had arranged beforehand to get a bed from Sears that morning and had it in the back of my truck. I dragged the queen mattress across the barren of the kitchen floor into a place that had been divided off by 16th-inch wood panel into a bedroom. For the next 9 months, this would be my home. If the grubby kitchen table and the one chair that was sitting in the place wouldn't have been included, the only thing in the place would have been that bed. That would be it, except for my alarm clock on the floor. Get up at 4 a.m, drive, work like a coal miner until sunset, drive, drink whiskey, drop on the bed in coveralls, rinse, repeat for hundreds of days, literally. Then, one Friday evening in October, I'd come home after a particularly brutal day of dragging my ass through the mud. My feet finally hit the kitchen floor at around 11 at night, and I was in a mood. I sat down at that pissant kitchen table, in my fire-retardant coveralls, covered in mud past my waist. I don't know if you've ever worked these kinds of hours in these kinds of conditions, but after a while, you stop caring about just about anything. I sat there and downed about half a pint of whiskey in a quarter pint of a time, and smoked cigarette after cigarette, lit each one of the buggers with the last one I'd smoked. I knew I was in trouble with the drinking and smoking, but as with most things, I didn't give a damn. I'd become married again, married to work, married to the mud, married to the oil, married to the welding, the pipe, and married to the hours that turned me as dirty as the place I'd inhabited. After I'd finished hating on my body for about an hour, I noticed it was past midnight, and I knew I'd have to be up in 6 hours. That was considered our day off up there, not starting work until 8 AM on the weekends. I crashed down on my bed, coveralls still wrapped around my waist, commando underneath, the rust scraper I'd carried to remove scale from the welds before I x-rayed them still in my side pocket, reached over and clicked on the alarm button with a sigh. I remember thinking that I was pretty sure that none of this was worth the money. I was a shell of a human being. In those days, I'd often drift in and out of consciousness while trying to sleep. I'd be buzzed, overtired, and really just resting until the next onslaught of hundreds of welds. I remember that night hearing a fair amount of scratching in the kitchen just past the partition that made the door to my room. At one point, I think I took an exception to it and grumbled a bit at it. The mice, rats and roaches were louder than usual. Who knew what the hell the crackheads were doing next door tonight? Then I remember drifting off into a numbed, half-dreaming state. The scratching had stopped. I hadn't been laid in months and started into a semi-dream about a woman I'd seen earlier at a gas station in one of the nameless towns we'd passed through as a crew. Then I saw her shadowy form at the foot of my bed, and I smiled. Then, as my eyes slowly registered, half open, I realized that I was no longer dreaming, and that it wasn't her, and that he was breathing loud. He was standing at the foot of my bed, and as I froze in terror for what seemed like 15 seconds, he grabbed my foot. "Lisa," he breathed out at me in a slurred, throated pitch that brought with it the smell of a chemical that managed to overshadow both the whiskey in my breath and the hovel smell that was the atmosphere I lived in. Now, I'm not a huge guy, but when I get all kinds of freaked out, I'm fairly strong. I remember not even thinking, just reacting. I pulled a scraper from my side pocket and launched myself, rolling sideways off the bed, wrenching my foot from his grip. I don't think I'd even hit the ground before I was on my feet, and I swung hard. I not only felt skull when that scraper connected with the front of his head, but I heard it scrape across that shadow. The next blur would have been comedic relief had the situation not been what it was. He howled in pain, and almost in a hurt feelings kind of way. Because I was still half drunk and had launched myself at him like a linebacker practicing on a full height tackle, my head went straight into the goddamn wall near the edge of my door and sent me back straight onto the bed. I hit damn hard whilst hyper-intelligently yelling, "Gah!" I remember the sound of my scraper hitting the kitchen floor with a sounding clang, and I remember the bright flash as I fell backwards, and right before I lost consciousness, I remember thinking, "Oh damn, he's got me." I passed out. When I came to, I don't really remember how much time had passed. I came back slowly, but as soon as I remembered what was going on, I made an attempt to leap back to my feet, and dizzy as a dog that's been beaten, I fell sideways onto my left arm and felt it crunch under my weight. I remember screaming, "Damn, damn, damn, damn," as loud as I could before I got back up and charged into the kitchen. I slammed the heel of my hand into the wall where the light switch was, flooding the greasy yellow light over the mess that was my kitchen. The front door was wide open. I was standing in blood, and no one was there. I remember hearing scurrying behind the door across the hall from me, like someone was trying to figure out what was going on in the cacophony that was my crap hole apartment. I had a few lengths of pipe in the kitchen. They were 2 to 4 inches of pipe cutouts, but welded together as test welds. I brought them home as examples of weld defects to study. I grabbed a 2-inch diameter sample of the pipe that was about 3 feet long and ran at my front door. No one there. I don't really know how long I was out for in the bedroom, but as the realization that the intruder had fled crept onto me, so did the adrenaline leave me. I began shaking, dropped the pipe, and sat down on the floor right in my doorway. The chick who was living across the hall opened the door and asked me if I was okay. I sat there, bare-chested and muddy covered overalls to my waist, curly hair turned into a Jimi Hendrix on a bad night, with blood from my forehead running across my face. I'm sure I absolutely stunk, and stunk of the whiskey that had threw me into my doorway. It was probably a classic YouTube moment as I Jack Nicholson looked up at her with my pointy eyebrows and sarcastically doled out at her, "Does it look like I'm okay?" She just slowly closed the door and probably figured I was another oil field crackhead who'd gone off the trails for another holiday. What I saw then really bothered me, almost more than the intrusion. The entire outer door frame had been removed from the outside of my entrance door. That guy had worked hard to get in there. He wanted in. He wanted in quietly, and whoever Lisa was, I'm certain that he hadn't intended her much good. Oddly, I remember feeling more nauseous about whoever was breaking in and doing God knows what to a stranger named Lisa than I felt about the actual intrusion. I stood up, closed the door, and picked up the overturned kitchen chair, plunking down into it. Then I almost puked across the kitchen table, and whatever drunk there was left in me suddenly dissipated. For one of the few times in my life, I was genuinely frightened, and I do not frighten easily. I remember waiting a while before I called the cops. At that time, the RCMP were often few in number and overworked in those remote areas. They never even showed up until hours later, explaining that since I told them he was no longer there, they felt I was safe. Later, when I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, face blooded, left arm screaming in pain, someone else's blood on my hand, I remember wiping my hand across the mirror to try get some of the grunge off the glass. I sat there and stared at the blood I left in the mirror for a good 10 minutes and decided that my time in that town was over. Called my boss when the sun came up and told him he'd either be putting me back up in the hotel or I was driving down south and he could hire whatever deranged goddamn crackhead he wanted. He agreed after I explained the night, and so came the end of my tenure in Hines Creek.